The views and opinions expressed in The Fact Is with Hollis Grant are those of Hollis Grant and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Droids Canada Network. Droids Canada Network does not take responsibility for any content or position produced by Hollis Grant and his show. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of The Fact Is. I am your host, Hollis Grant. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about farming. We're going to be talking about farming in Canada and how expensive it will become. Now, if you remember a couple months ago, and here we are sitting in August of 2022, and a couple months ago there was a giant crisis around the world that happened. It was when Russia invaded Ukraine, and suddenly prices of gas went up. Oil went up. Natural gas went up. Then we also had grain shortages. Everything was being blamed on evil Putin in Russia. But then we find out a couple months later that really that's not the case at all, and everything's going on as normal, and Russia has a very strong economy. It's the strongest economy they have ever had, and it has surpassed their 1992 levels. That was the first year that they became a capitalist society, if we're going to use the term capitalist, but no longer a communist regime. They're having a fantastic year. They're doing really well. But what about the rest of the world? What's the rest of the world really concerned about? And it comes down to two words: climate crisis. Every politician around the world and any Western civilization is saying and screaming from the top of their lungs that we are all going to die if we don't do anything. In fact, we're going to die next year if we don't do anything. That's why governments today are taking steps to ensure that they reduce the climate crisis by not 2023, but in fact by 2030, because it's so bad we're going to die immediately, but we're going to put in place that we're going to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2030. Nonetheless, let's take a look at what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, or Prime Minister Blackface Justin Trudeau, is doing to address climate crisis in grain. This article is taken from Bloomberg.com. And the title is Trudeau Spars with Farmers on Climate Plan Risking Grain Output. Canada wants to cut fertilizer emissions, but farmers say it could result in less food. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's push to accelerate the fight against climate change is sparking a showdown with the nation's farmers, who says it's threatening food supplies and their profits. This article is from July 27th of 2022. The government is proposing to cut emissions from fertilizer by 30% by 2030 as part of a plan to get to net zero in the next 3 decades. But growers are saying that to achieve that, they may have to shrink grain output significantly at a time when the world is scrambling for more supplies. Also at stake is the estimated $10.4 billion, and that's $8.08 billion US, that farmers could lose this decade from the reduced output. The tension comes as efforts to cut carbon dioxide emissions related to energy are lagging, so policymakers are increasingly looking to other sectors, including agriculture. Climate targets on nitrogen in the Netherlands, for example, spurred protests from farmers worried they'd be forced out of business. Cattle and fertilizer are key sources of nitrogen emissions. Angry Dutch farmers brought cows to Parliament, threatened to slaughter them, and blockade food distribution centers serving major supermarkets. If you push farmers against the wall with no wiggle room, I don't know where this will end up, said Gunther Joachim, president of Western Canada Wheat Growers Association, which represents growers who farm about 3 million acres. Just look at what's happening in Europe and the Netherlands. They've had enough of it. Now let me ask you a question. How many articles have you seen about the protests in the Netherlands? These were major protests that shut down streets and cities, and police were called in, riot police were called in. It was a major news story. And did you hear about this through the mainstream or legacy media. Production losses could be significant according to analysts commissioned by Fertilizer Canada. Canada could lose over 160 million metric tons of canola, corn, and spring wheat between 2023 and 2030 due to the plan. According to the report, that's nearly double Canada's expected grain production this season. Agricultural emissions have soared in recent decades as farmers apply more fertilizer to increase output. Emissions from crop soils rose 87% to about 7.6 metric tons of carbon dioxide over 3 decades through 2020, according to the latest data from the Environment and Climate Change Canada. By comparison, emissions from oil and gas extraction more than tripled by 69 metric tons of carbon dioxide in the same period. We are talking about the food supply, said Karen Proud, Chief Executive Officer of Fertilizer Canada, an industry group that represents major manufacturers and retailers, including Nutrien Limited and Koch Fertilizer Canada. You may recognize that name, the Koch family. There's more on that on another episode at a later time, and again, go back and take a look at all of our past episodes on droidscanada.com. Canada is already among the top countries that use nitrogen effectively. We don't have much room to go before we start affecting yields. While the reduction target is ambitious, it does not represent a mandatory reduction in fertilizer use. An actionable focus on improving nitrogen management. Cameron Newbigging, spokesman for the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, said in a statement, "The approach for achieving reductions is still under development, and the government is accepting feedback until August 31st and will develop next steps in the approach once the consultations are complete," he said. Farmers are already trying to reduce their fertilizer usage because costs have skyrocketed. They're using specialized equipment to apply it more efficiently. Wheat growers, Yoakum said, government incentives to offset the cost of new equipment or soil testing could help reduce emissions without jeopardizing food production, said Jim Everson, president of the Canola Council of Canada. "I hope there's an ability for the government to listen," said Bill Campbell, president of the Keystone Agriculture Producers. "I certainly hope the policies don't become reactionary." Saskatchewan grower Ian McCurry says more education is needed to help farmers cut fertilizer usage. McCurry, a member of Farmers for Climate Solutions, estimates his fertilizer usage dropped as much as 20% per acre after he spent $50,000 into equipment changes and mapping and testing the soil on his farm to determine how much nitrogen he needs. The move probably saved him $20,000 in input costs this year and hasn't reduced yields, he said. "We've simply taken nitrogen out of the areas of the field that we're not using it anyway," McCurry said. Now, one thing that you notice in this particular article, and you wonder why food costs are so high and everything's so high, is how many different regulatory groups that this article cites. The problem with Canada, at least, and you can see it starting to be a problem in America, is how these groups, modern-day unions, bog down and slow down progress. Government's job nowadays, in the last 50 years, has shifted from being responsible with the taxpayers' money to it is our right to spend our money. This is our money, and we are entitled to making our budget, and we have to spend all of our money, because if we don't spend it this year, it means we're going to have less for next year. So we have to spend at all costs and get rid of any excess money in the budget, or else we don't get an increase in the budget. When a government starts thinking that way, you know you have a problem. And this is why Canada is taxed at nearly a 50% tax ratio, 30% being from federal and provincial just taxes alone, but we're not getting into sales tax and, of course, new carbon tax and carbon tax emissions, or getting into the nitrogen taxes that we've talked about in this particular article. So is the solution raising more money? Is climate change really that big of a deal, knowing that they're only trying to curb this by 2030 and not by 2023? Because if it was such an immediate danger, would we not be taking action upon this now? Love to hear what you have to say. So reach out to us on Facebook, on Twitter, and of course on droidscanada.com. I'd like to thank you once again for listening to The Fact Is. I'm your host, Hollis Grant, and we hope you have yourself a great week. And see you next time.
Dan, what happens every Thursday?
That would be DCR Droids Canada Radio.
And what time is it out on Thursday?
That's from 9 till 11 p.m.
Dumb question, where do you find it?
You find that at accessradio.ca.
And what's the best part?
It's free.